Welcome to Tanakh Talk. I'm your host, William Hall, broadcasting to you live out of Kingsland, Texas, USA, with another fine episode of Rabbi Michael Skovac's A Rabbi Cross-Examines the New Testament. Today we are on episode 17, Matthew chapter 14, and it looks like we may be going into 15 if we have enough time. So coming to you from Canada, Rabbi Michael Skovac, and go to his website, JewsForJudaism.ca. You got to write this down. Tons of stuff, and you're going to want to watch him and follow along with his juicy stuff he's doing now that's not available yet. I know it's such a temptation, but hey, we got to wait. You got to wait till after dinner to get the ice cream, right, Rabbi?
No, just come to Canada.
Hey, yeah. Oh, that's great. Great news. Great news. Okay, fantabulous. Well, Rabbi, it's been another long week. Everybody goes through ups and downs, and boy, I've had some funky downs this week with some technical challenges, but with every new challenge, well, that was a nice fade out. With every new challenge, comes some tweaking that actually improves things a little bit each time. So I'm okay with that.
That's good.
So Rabbi, you were telling me that you've got a pretty smooth set for tonight, and you may even leak maybe into 15, which would be kind of cool.
That's a good way of putting it.
Yeah. Well, I'm thinking if we do that and we really seize those opportunities, we might actually get our episodes and chapters matching up. Well, at least until we end Matthew, that is. Then we'll be on episode 90.
That'll be a good trick if we can synchronize that.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. Wow, very good.
It's interesting. Like sometimes, we have the Jewish calendar dates, and when they can sync with the English calendar dates. Like sometimes the 4th of June, might be the 4th of Sivan, which would be cool if you can do that. But usually they're out of sync, and you have to sort of, get them more synchronized.
Right.
But yeah, I don't know if we're going to actually finish 2 chapters tonight. That's sort of wishful thinking, but
sure. Sure.
You never know.
Very good. I'm glad I didn't catch any grief whatsoever about the picture that I chose for this one, but I was tossed between so many different things to use. But this, the beheading of John the Baptist is probably the most obvious thing that happens in this chapter. So I figured it might be a nice little theme to go with.
Well, it's the most gruesome picture you're going to get.
Yeah. Well, no, actually, this was the mildest one. I was like, I was working with the couple, and I edited the entire picture, and then I was like, oh no, that's just way too gross, man. So as I was going back and forth with different title ideas, I came across this bronze, and I was like, well, the bronze is kind of, at least it's, at least it's bronze.
You don't see the red blood spurting out.
Yeah, I know. There were some really bad ones. I was like, oh my gosh, I need to change the settings on my search engine. Jeez, Wheezy. Man, I've not been one known to have a super weak stomach, but man, I wasn't prepared for this week's broadcast.
All right.
But now we are. Rabbi, what do you have for us this week?
So, it's a relatively short chapter. It's got a couple of interesting parts. The first part, which takes us to, I guess, verse 12, is the whole story of the beheading of John the Baptizer. And, there's a bit of a confusion about who the persona are, because when you go through the gospel story, it doesn't seem to line up exactly with what Josephus writes in terms of who is who in the story, but I'm not going to get into that. Just wanted to focus on a few things. First of all, this is not the same Herod, obviously, that we read about in the beginning of Matthew. This is Herod Antipas. He's the next generation in the Herod line. And it's interesting that the chapter begins by him hearing about the incredible fame of Jesus. And this has been a theme that we've run into a number of times already, that the Gospels, at least so far in Matthew, are consistently testifying to the fact that Jesus was popular and famous and, a rock star, and everybody knew about him throughout the entire region. And, again, it doesn't line up with what Christians maintain, which is that this Jesus was the suffering servant spoke about in Isaiah chapter 53. However, there, we're told that this servant of God is going to be not popular at all, but not hugely popular, but the exact opposite is going to be literally despised and hated by everyone, not just a small group of people. So again, this is the continuing in this theme, which we've seen many, many times, about how famous Jesus is. Now, for some reason, there's a really strange verse in verse 2 where he says to his servants, this is John, the Herod, the tetrarch. He says, this is John the Baptist. So I don't know. I guess they must be in the prison area with him. And he points out that he's risen from the dead, which is a very strange thing to hear. I mean that, John the Baptizer has been, in our stories before, he was someone that was proclaiming the coming kingdom of God. He was immersing people in the Jordan River. He was telling people to repent. And then he gets locked up in prison. And then we saw that he forgets that he had this meeting with Jesus back at the Jordan River. But for some reason, he says here that this John the Baptizer has been risen from the dead. So it's hard to understand where that's coming from. And I would say possibly it may be associated with the idea that was floated about already in Matthew. We saw it in chapter 11. We're going to see it again in chapter 17, that there was at least some rumor that John the Baptizer may have been Elijah the prophet. That was at least what the Gospels here are trying to put forward. And so maybe because John the Baptizer associated with Elijah the prophet, that there's an assumption that he maybe is Elijah who's come back from the dead, although we know Elijah never died, but still he sort of disappeared from the face of the earth to go up to heaven. So maybe that's why they're speaking about him here as someone who's come back from the dead. Otherwise, I can't make rhyme or reason out of this phrase. Mm-hmm. And basically what happens is that, one of the women in the story here has a grievance against John the Baptizer because he complained about her marriage, saying that it was violated the Torah's laws against prohibited marriages. And so basically what ends up happening is that the request that this woman's daughter makes is that Herod give her the head of John the Baptizer. Now, in the King James Version here, it says to put him on a charger. Now, I guess if you're reading this in a King James translation, you don't understand Old English, you're not going to know what putting someone's head on a charger means. It really means a platter, or, some kind of a tray. So that she wants his head brought in on a platter or tray. And it's interesting that the king here, Herod, is sorry about it. In verse 9, it says he didn't really want to do it, but he seemed to be sort of obligated. It reminds me, what's going to happen later on when Pontius Pilate doesn't want to execute Jesus, but he's also sort of forced into it, allegedly. Now, it is a gruesome story, and the question is, where do you see any parallels to this in Jewish literature of someone being beheaded and their head being brought in on a platter? So there is only one similar story in all of rabbinic literature, and it's a story that's based upon the rabbinic midrash to the book of Esther, where Memuchan. Now, Memuchan is one of the names of Haman. So Haman is the arch villain, the arch enemy of the story, but he's referred to in some of the verses as Memuchan. And he tells the king Achashverosh to bring the head of the disobedient Vashti to him on a platter. Right? Vashti was the king's wife who refused to appear, before all the guests at the party. It says in the text of the book of Esther, he wanted her to appear in her royal crown, and the rabbis say that that's all he wanted her to wear. He wanted to dance naked, and so she refuses. And in the midrash at least, Haman requests that her head be brought on a platter. Now, what's interesting is that in Mark chapter 6, verse 33, what Herod says here is very similar to what happens in the book of Esther. In Mark chapter 6, verse 33, you have Herod saying, "Whatever you ask me, I'll give you even half of my kingdom. That's what he seems to be saying to this woman, and what she asks for is the head of John the Baptizer. And interestingly, in the book of Esther, chapter 5, verse either 3 or 4, and chapter 7, verse 2, that's exactly what the king there says to Esther, that ask for whatever you want, up to half the kingdom, I'll give it to you. So you have at least these literary parallels between this story and the story in the book of Esther, but otherwise, it's, as far as I am concerned, a bit of a strange story. Next piece here, beginning in verse 13, has again one of the miracle stories in the Gospels. And again, what we're seeing, and we should really be attentive to this, there are certain, what I would call meta themes. There are certain themes that just keep on repeating over and over again in the Gospel stories. One of them is the theme of the miracles of Jesus. I mean, this has been one of the major themes so far. And again, obviously the Christian scriptures are hyping this, that for them, these miracles are very significant, that, you see from Jesus himself that he expected these miracles to be a slam dunk in proving that he was the Messiah. And yet, interestingly, he himself says in Matthew 24, verse 24, that even false messiahs are able to do miracles. So we know throughout the Hebrew scriptures that you don't prove that someone is a prophet or anything else just because they can do miracles, because we know that bad guys can do miracles as well. So one theme that we see here in this part of the chapter, and we've seen before and will continue to see, are the miracle stories of Jesus. And the other theme that we have begun to see lately is the theme of the hostility of the rabbis to Jesus. Somehow it's an emerging theme that picks up sort of a week or two ago and is going to continue to build, that the rabbis really have it in for Jesus. So what's really going on is that the tension, the hostility is really moved. It is no longer really an issue of the Romans versus the Jews. You don't get that sense at all from the Gospels that Jesus is in any danger from the Romans. It's really clearly that the major enemy, the major threat to him are these rascally rabbis. And so that's going to come up in this chapter as well. Now, the miracle here is very similar to stories in the second book of Kings, chapters 42 to 44, and chapter 4, verse 7, where people are able to multiply oil and multiply food, and it's somehow on a lesser scale than here. Here he's able to take just a handful of of bread and multiply it to feed 5,000 men. That's aside from the women and children. But it's basically a miracle of feeding a lot of people a little bit of food. And what's interesting for our purposes is if you go to verse 19, where it says that he commanded the multitude to sit down on the grass, and took the 5 loaves and the 2 fishes, and looking up to heaven, he blessed. He said a blessing, and he broke, and he gave the loaves to the disciples, and the disciples to the multitude. Now, this order of doing things, where you first take the bread and you bless the bread, you make a blessing, and then you break the bread and distribute it, is actually exactly what the rabbis required. Meaning that what's interesting is that this blessing that's said before the eating of bread is not a biblical blessing. According to the scriptures, the only blessing that's really mandated is the blessing after you've eaten the meal. That's in Deuteronomy chapter 8, verse 10, where the Torah says, "Ve'achalta v'savata uverachta." You shall eat, you shall be satiated, and then you shall bless the Lord your God. So you see from the scriptures that there was a mandated blessing after you've consumed a meal, after you've eaten and been satisfied, but there's nothing in the Bible about saying a blessing before you eat. So here you have another example of Jesus following rabbinical law, meaning that he's someone that is doing exactly what is taught by the sages of the Talmud and the rabbinical teachings, that the blessings that come before food are not biblical, but they're rabbinic. And again, we've seen consistently so far that Jesus seems to be someone who is consistent in his following of rabbinic teaching. So that's really all I had to share on this piece of the miracle story. Again, we've analyzed miracles so many times already, and the next story is beginning on verse 22 and going until verse 33, which is the very famous story. If you had to ask most non-Christians even name one of the miracles of Jesus, they would probably mention that he was able to walk on water. I think that
Right.
Chris Angel recently walked on water.
Mhm.
So you have to know where the pebbles are. But this little chapter begins in verse 22 by, again, testifying to how popular Jesus is, because he has to send multitudes of people away. He's got all, again, he's like a rock star. There are always these multitudes following him around. And then we're told that he gets onto a ship, and they were in the middle of the sea, tossed by the waves, because the wind was really, I guess, rocking the ship. And in verse 25, in the fourth watch of the night, Jesus went to them walking on the sea. Now, it's interesting that the Talmud discusses, actually, whether there are 3 or 4 watches to the evening. And the basic conclusion is, according to Jewish law, there are 3 watches during the evening, three different watches. But here, the gospel writer seems to go with 4 watches, which is really more of what Romans were using as their system. And Mark chapter 13 actually names these 4 watches. In verse 35 there, in Mark 13:35, he refers to the evening watch, the midnight watch, the cock crowing watch, and the morning watch. So there are 4 watches, but apparently they weren't going by the rabbinical standard, which is 3 watches during the evening. In verse 26, when they see him walking on the water, it says they were bothered, saying it was a spirit or an apparition, and they cried out for fear. Now, that to me is an interesting verse. They're assuming that what they're seeing, and then they're seeing him walking on water, and it is him that's walking on the water somehow miraculously, but they don't assume it's Jesus. They assume it's a ghost or an apparition. So I wonder, how does this impact the alleged post-resurrection sightings of Jesus we're going to see later on in the Gospels? That's going to have to factor into those stories, because you have a number of post-resurrection sightings of Jesus, but the real question at the end of the day is, did they really see Jesus? If it's not so clear,
Right.
who you're seeing, this is sort of setting us up here for that question, because at the end of the day, they are seeing Jesus here, and yet they don't think it's him. They think it's an apparition or a ghost. So we'll have to bring this into the calculus when we analyze the post-resurrection stories. And just one more thing I'll point out, which is, or maybe 2 things. In verse 30, they say when he saw the wind that was boisterous, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, he cried out. This is Peter, by the way, I think. He cries out, "Lord, save me." Now, one of the things that you see here is that they're using the word save in a Jewish biblical sense, right? We've already seen that in the Jewish Bible, the word save and salvation refer to people being rescued from physical harm. And it's only sort of a more New Testament usage of the word where save implies that you're saved from your sins. That's why they name Jesus Yeshua in Matthew chapter 1, verse 21. He's called Yeshua because he will save his people from their sins. But that's an unusual and really non-biblical use of the word salvation. And you see here a more accurate biblical, Jewish biblical, Hebrew biblical usage of the word salvation to refer to physical salvation. Now, the last verse in this portion is problematic. In verse 33, it says that they that were in the ship came and worshipped him. Now, we already discussed in the past whether or not this phrase "worshiping him" means that they pray to him as a divine being, meaning that as we pray to God, or does it mean that they were showing respect to him? We know that the word in Greek there can mean a form of showing respect, in the same way that you can bow down to someone in worship, in the same way that people would bow to idols, or there's bowing to show respect. In the Bible, You find that when they came to Egypt in the time of Jacob, they bowed down to Pharaoh as a sign of respect. It doesn't mean they're worshiping him as a god. So these passages in the Gospels really are unclear. I'm sure that Trinitarians love this kind of verse because they'll say, well, look, it says they worshiped him and they said, you are the Son of God. So again, the Son of God mean that someone is divine, is God himself. We see in the Jewish scriptures, in the Hebrew Bible, that human beings, normal human beings, are referred to as sons of God. You see that in Deuteronomy 14:1. All the Jewish people are called children of God. You find that Solomon is referred to as a son of God. And the Jewish people in Exodus 4:22. B'ni bechori Yisrael, my son, my firstborn is Israel. So again, a Trinitarian that's invested in proving that Jesus was God and acknowledges God would get excited about this verse. I'm not so sure that this is a slam dunk for their case. And then finally, I think this is finally, starting in verse 34, you have, again, more miraculous healings. So there's been a lot of healings and miracles in this chapter. And in verse 36, it speaks about those that came to touch the hem of his garment. Really, it's referring to, as we saw before in chapter 9, verse 20, his tzitzit, his fringes. And interestingly, in this week's Torah portion that we just read last week, in Shlach, in chapter 15 in the book of Numbers, there is the source in the Bible, the first source for the mitzvah, the commandment to attach fringes on the corners of a garment. And it seems that that's exactly what was described here. Again, another testimony to the fact that Jesus, in all likelihood, was Torah observant. So from my point of view, that's the end of chapter 14. Unless you had something to bring up.
No, I'll tell you what, the only thing that was coming to my mind was, we hear about all the miracles and stuff that's all through. In fact, I don't know what book it's in, you probably do, where it says that his miracles were so great, and they was like, this guy, he must be sent from God because of these amazing miracles that are so out there. And in my mind, I'm thinking, in all of the recordings of, like in Jewish literature and all this other stuff, the works of Josephus and all this other stuff, if these miracles were so like out there, like, oh my God, so amazingly bizarre that this guy is doing all these miracles, why aren't these miracles written anywhere else? Why are they just secluded to the New Testament teachings?
Well, I mean, you have more of a problem than that. You have just a general ignoring of Jesus altogether in writings outside the Gospels. So you don't really have a mention of him in Josephus, except for a very, very highly disputed passage. Although you do have James mentioned, his brother James is mentioned in Josephus, but Jesus is really not mentioned. And he's not really mentioned in Philo, who lived exactly the same time, from Alexandria. And he's not mentioned, really in most of there may be a passing reference in Tacitus, but, after his life, actually. It's not during his lifetime. So there really isn't much attention to him at all, let alone his miracles.
If you find someone like that in our day, what happens? You get on TV and your name is Chris Angel.
Well, it's interesting.
It's advertised. It's all over the place.
I used to be on the mailing list of a lot of Christian ministries. And, they would talk about their crusades in different parts of the world. They would go to, parts of Southeast Asia, and they'd go to New Guinea, and they would go to, all these really remote places. And they'd have these major crusades where they would bring back people from the dead, and people that were missing limbs would grow their limbs back, and people that were deaf and blind would be able to hear and see. I mean, they reported these absolutely incredible miracles, and I always wondered, wow, that's a pretty amazing news story. Why isn't anyone reporting it?
Right.
And then I would wonder, if these guys can do that, in New Guinea somewhere, why don't they just come home and clean out the emergency room of their hospitals?
Exactly.
The rabbis have a saying, "Harotze l'shaker yarchik adusav." If you want to, fib, put your witnesses far away. So obviously, when you're telling a story about a miracle that's done, 3,000 miles away, where there's no news crews around, you could say whatever you want. They're not telling stories like this, about the emergency room in Detroit or in New York. No one's bringing back people from the dead in those places.
Rabbi, I do have a question for you.
Yeah.
This just came up maybe 30 minutes ago, 45 minutes ago. And I don't know how important it is, but it is to a few people. Was John the Baptist and Pilate, were they really like sort of close? I mean, I think I got the Pilate wrong. Remember in verse, I think it was in this very first verse here. Oh, I'm sorry, not Pilate, Herod. Because at first it says he wanted to kill him, but then after the head was mentioned, it says he was sorry. Well, one of the comments that was made was that Herod and John the Baptist were kind of enjoyed each other, and that and the statement was that there's documents, writings, historical writings in the archives of like the Catholic Church that tell about the relationship between Herod and John the Baptist. Have you heard of anything like this? Is there any such writings?
I'm not familiar with it, but it wouldn't surprise me, because the truth is, all we're familiar with is the 27 books of the Greek Testament. But the truth is that there are many, many, many writings that we have from those first, 1 or 2 centuries, that didn't make it into the canon of the Christian Bible. You have, what are sometimes called the apocryphal Gospels, and there are lots of them. And we don't even have all the ones that were written, but we have a number of that have survived. And then aside from those apocryphal Gospels, you have many, many other books that were written, by various either church fathers or what they refer to as the apostolic fathers, people like that. And they're written really, in some cases, around the same time as the books that made it into the New Testament. So, it's quite possible that there are some writings that are not part of the canon that do go into more detail, about what was going on at that time. As a matter of fact, in Mel Gibson's terrible movie, Passion of the Christ, he made use of some of these writings. Now, these were, of course, later writings. I mean, there were writings, there were visions that some nuns had about what happened during the time of the Passion. And, but you have similar writings going back already to the 1st and 2nd centuries. So it's quite possible there are writings that fill in the details in terms of the relationship between Herod Antipas, and John the Baptizer. I'm just not familiar with them. You have a lot of ancient writings that try to speak about the life of Jesus, things that are not mentioned about him in the Gospels. So it would not surprise me in the least. I'll try to look into that.
Okay, so the follow-up question is, which verse do you believe? Do you believe that he wanted to kill him, or that he didn't want to kill him?
Well, that's a good question. There would have to be, a sort of a historical psychiatrist to be able to go back in time and penetrate someone's mind. I mentioned during my lecture tonight on Paul, I gave a talk tonight on whether Paul is the founder of Christianity. And, someone had asked afterwards, what motivated Paul to do what he was doing? Because I was trying to show that Paul really diverged and really went off course from the original Jesus movement. And so the question is, why? Why did he do this? What motivated him? What motivated him to have this single-minded, and ferocious ministry to the Gentiles? I mean, he was really driven to try to bring his vision of who Jesus was to, the entire Gentile world. And if you read, the missionary journeys he took, without the use of a Lear jet, I mean, he was traveling, widely and quickly and under very difficult circumstances. So it's hard to really enter into his mind and try to presume to understand why someone living 2,000 years ago does what they do, or doesn't do what they might want to do. My reading of these characters, these Roman rulers and these Idumean rulers like Herod, they're pretty bloodthirsty people. They didn't get and maintain their power by being pacifists. So if he has any reason to lop off the head of this guy that's in prison, I mean, it's not someone that he necessarily has working for him in the public. This is a guy that's in jail. And if someone close to him says, I want his head on a platter, I can't imagine that he really would resist that with too much intensity. So it's not clear why he would balk, why it says here that he wasn't happy about doing it. He just felt compelled because of the oath that he had taken. But it's hard to know. I mean, maybe, as you point out, there might have been some relationship between them. Maybe he came to admire John the Baptizer. I mean, he was a very charismatic person. So it's possible that he came to admire him and he didn't feel good about, doing, I mean, it was pretty brutal to take off someone's head and put it on a platter. So even probably a brutal, violent person like him might have had his limits, and he might have thought this was going too far. Maybe he had a strained relationship with this woman that was making the request. It's really hard to know.
I've heard that that Herod was. I think I heard this through one historian, that he had gotten so psychopathic that he was plotting to kill everybody who was even close to his throne. He was just terrified.
That was the other Herod. That was Herod. Herod the Great. In the second chapter of Matthew, we know, he bumped off his own children, many people in his family. I mean, he was, paranoid to the nth degree, where, he would kill people at the drop of a hat. I don't think we have the same knowledge that this Herod, Antipas, was, quite as brutal and as paranoid. But, even if he wasn't, my suspicion is that he was probably a tough guy, and probably was not adverse to killing people if there was any reason to. And here, he made a promise, and here is this, this girl who's, somehow related to him, that he feels, responsible to fulfill his oath. So maybe for whatever reasons he wasn't thrilled to do it, but he certainly did it. So it's hard to know, really. It really is hard to know. It's a good question. We'll have to just sort of speculate and leave it as a bit of a question mark.
That'll work.
So do you want to begin at least chapter 15?
I think so. Yeah, let's do that, Rabbi. I think that would be good. Get us
rather than just cut it short.
Yes. I mean, even though you haven't eaten yet. This will have to be your food for the night.
This will be the appetizer.
Yeah, I feel like the taskmaster all of a sudden.
Well, let's do the first part at least.
Okay.
You have here in chapter 15, I mentioned before that one of the meta themes of the Gospels is this attack on the rabbis, attacks on the Pharisees, attacks on the traditions, the rabbinic traditions. So this is one of those chapters, and I think the other big one is Matthew 23, which is actually interesting because it's a bit of a mixed message there, because the chapter there begins by Jesus, enthusiastically endorsing the rulings of the rabbis. So how do you, on the same time, pay Peter and take from Peter and pay Paul? It's a strange chapter because it begins with this glowing endorsement of the Pharisees and then slams them for the rest of the chapter. So it's not impossible to thread that needle. We'll do that when we get to chapter 23. But here you again have, another portion of the Gospels that laces into the Pharisees and the rabbinic leaders. So here, the chapter begins by saying that these scribes and Pharisees from Jerusalem actually came to Jesus. Now, if he wasn't in Jerusalem at the time, it seems that they came from Jerusalem to wherever he was, and they had to make a special trip. And usually the rabbinic leaders, this Pharisees from Jerusalem, were often the more senior and respected rabbinical authorities. So these would not have been third string Pharisees. They would have been probably more first string Pharisees. So what do? They come to Jesus saying, "Why do your disciples transgress the tradition of the elders?" Now, it's interesting that we had this before where they were asking Jesus why his disciples were plucking grains on the Sabbath. And, in the same way as in that chapter, they don't criticize or question Jesus. I mean, they're not really catching him doing the wrong thing. They're questioning the behavior of his students. And that might be significant. Why is it that his students are not playing ball? But they want to know why they are transgressing the tradition of the elders, because they don't wash their hands before eating bread. Now, this is a very difficult story because the history of hand washing before eating bread is not really so simple. It's mentioned in the Mishnah, in Tractate Brachot, and it seems that, and again, I'm not entirely clear on this, but it seems that originally the only people who were obligated to wash their hands before eating bread would have been the priests, because the priests didn't just eat any kind of bread. The priests ate what is referred to as truma. That was the portion of food that was donated to the priests. Usually it was approximately 2% of a person's produce went to the priests, and then 10% after that went to the Levites. But this food, the truma, was considered to be sacred food, and it could only be eaten with someone who had not become ritually impure. So for the priests, all the way going back to the Bible, this is not something which is a recent innovation. The priests would have to purify themselves before eating bread, this truma bread at least. So the question is this: when did it become obligatory for people to just all wash their hands before they ate bread? And we're not talking here, by the way, about washing for the sake of cleanliness. That is always required for all people. You're not supposed to, do something where your hands are really filthy or contaminated physically, and then go eat your food. You should always wash up before eating. And speaking here specifically about a ritual purification by sort of a form of what you might call baptism. The hands are washed by taking a vessel of water and pouring it over each hand, sort of by going over the right and the left and the right and the left and the right and the left in the morning or before a meal, pouring it first over the right hand, then over the left hand. It seems that requirement was, again, only required for priests, and it may have been a voluntary stringency that some people accepted upon themselves to always make sure they ate whatever, even if they were not a priest, to always eat their food with hands that were pure. Actually, the whole term prushim, Pharisees, comes from this idea that the prushim, the Hebrew word parush, means separate. And so the Pharisees were people who not only did they accept the idea that there's an oral law and rabbinic tradition, but they were people who lived really according to a stricter standard of living. And so they were separated by these stringencies from the rest of the people. And one of the stringencies they had was to always be in a state of ritual purity. But again, it may not have been a requirement for the average Joe on the street until possibly around the year 100 of the Common Era. I mean, not until after the destruction of the temple was there a decree that all people should always wash their hands before eating bread. And the reason actually was interesting. The reason was that they wanted to sort of encourage and make sure that the priests themselves, even though there wasn't a temple anymore by the year 100, they wanted priests to never forget the importance of eating bread, eating truma at least, with their hands ritually pure. And so in order to sort of keep the priests, in the ball game, and not having them ever forget the importance of washing their hands, so they made a ruling that all people should always wash their hands, so that the whole nation would always be in the habit of washing their hands before they ate bread. But that would be a problem for this story here, because if the requirement itself didn't kick in till around the year 100, it's hard to know or understand why the Pharisees are giving Jesus' disciples a hard time here. Now, there is an opinion which says that this requirement may have come about a little bit earlier, but even there, it probably wasn't until around the time of the temple's destruction. It's not entirely clear to me when it would have been, but it's not so clear, and I think this has to be further researched, whether or not at the time that this story would have taken place, which would have been approximately 27 or 28 BCE, 27 or 28 CE of the Common Era, whether at that time in Jewish history there was a requirement for all Jews to always wash their hands before they had bread. So that I'll leave that as an open question, and maybe it can be further researched. But at least at this point, it's a little bit unclear to me.
Okay.
Now, another question that I would have here, though, is that I mentioned before that this sort of plays into this theme that's going to come up a lot in the Gospels of the rabbis sort of sniping at Jesus and hounding him and persecuting him. So what's strange to me is that if there is this agenda to snipe at Jesus and to find fault with Jesus, why do they choose, of all things, something relatively innocuous, like the fact that his disciples are not washing their hands before eating bread? Why didn't they pick on something like we saw in chapter 14, verse 33, where it seems to indicate that the disciples worshiped Jesus? That if that's what was really going on, meaning that if, as normative Christians want to believe, what you see from the Gospels is that they actually did worship Jesus, and it's come up already a few times in Matthew. We just saw it a few minutes ago. So why didn't the Pharisees pick on this? Meaning that would have been a much, much more serious offense than not washing their hands before a meal. So I think that one of the things that you see from this is that, to me, it's sort of proof that his disciples at this stage of the game did not see him as God and were not worshiping him, because if that was the case, that would have been, a really, really serious crime that the rabbis would have jumped all over.
Right. Okay.
So I think that, again, when we're trying to resolve, for example, when did historical Christianity come to see Jesus as God and begin to worship him? It's not even entirely clear in the writings of Paul if Paul really did see Jesus as God in the flesh entirely, because he basically, when we get to the writings of Paul, and I'm not sure when that's going to be, but they're sort of confusing and they're conflicted and they're often contradictory. So at the same time, Paul writes about, Jesus being this divine pre-existent being, and the fullness of God dwells in him. You have many statements in Paul that seem to have a very high Christology, a very high view of who Jesus was. You have many other places where he seems to insist that Jesus was subordinate to God.
Sure. Hey, Rabbi, this is a really delicate game of jump rope sometimes. We've got a caller.
Yes.
I figure, I don't know what his question was regarding, so we're going to bring him on the phone right now, let him ask his question, and we may have to backtrack, or it may be a totally different question. We'll see, okay? Okay, Alon, this is William at Tanakh Talk. Where are you calling from?
Hi, this is Alonso Echavarria. I spoke to you before, William,
yes,
from Big Spring, Texas.
Yes. Very good. We've got Rabbi Michael Skovak here tonight doing Matthew chapter 14 and 15. Do you have a question regarding those two chapters?
Yes. Thank you, Michael, Rabbi Michael Skovak. I've been watching your videos. Your videos are great. I was going to ask you about Matthew and Mark regarding the when Jesus goes in the boat. Is there another miracle there? Because Mark explains that he goes in a boat, and he says we're on a boat by themselves. And then I believe Matthew says it in a different way. Is there something else going on there?
Well, not in Matthew. I mean, in Matthew, it seems that the miracle in that chapter is his walking on the water. When we get to Mark, I didn't bother comparing the Matthew version here to the Mark version. So I'm not sure exactly the way the story is recounted in Mark. We'll have to see when we get to Mark. But here, it just seems that that's what's going on, that he astounds these people by walking on the water, which is a pretty cool trick.
Yeah, it's another miracle.
Very good.
Well, it does seem, look, when we try to ask ourselves, why does that story make it into the Christian Bible? Meaning, why do the gospel writers deem it important to let us know about this? And again, we have to bear in mind, just because the Gospels tell us that this happened, that's not necessarily, a courtroom proof that it happened. Meaning that all we're getting here is the claim that these writers make, that these things happened as they're reporting it. So, are these stories being totally fabricated? Possibly. Are these stories being exaggerated? Meaning that, in the feeding of the 5,000 men plus the women and children, it could be that there were 10,000 people sitting there. Is that an exaggeration? Maybe, there were some loaves of bread which fed, a couple of dozen people or 100 people, but was it 10,000 people sitting there? So you have two problems. Problem number one is the story at all taking place, or is it being fabricated out of whole cloth? Or was there something that happened, but it's basically being exaggerated and hyped in order to increase the effect? So again, we weren't there. We don't know. And I think one position to take is a skeptical position, which would say, you know what, until we have real proof, we just will not accept these stories at face value. Another point of view to take, as I've mentioned, is, to just say, for argument's sake, let's assume these stories happened as reported. But then the important question is, what would be proven by that? Meaning, would it be significant in the scheme of things? And so because we know that miracles are not unique to Jesus or to Christianity, so we know that our scriptures, the Tanakh, never tells us that the way in which we'll be able to identify the Messiah is through the miracles that he will do. That's just not how we're told to identify the Messiah. And the reason, again, is because miracles don't prove anything. So I can feel very comfortable at the end of the day, totally accepting the veracity of these stories. I would put my skeptical hat aside for a moment and accept the stories at face value for argument's sake, and say, okay, but so what? What would it prove? And then, in a moment of being more skeptical and more critical, I would say, okay, so what is the proof that we have that these stories actually took place as reported in the Gospels? As people have pointed out, if these stories really did take place, you would expect to have some echo of them elsewhere. Matthew says later on in chapter 27 that, at the crucifixion of Jesus, the graves of many righteous people opened up, and they came out of their graves, and they appeared to many people in Jerusalem. Now, that's the kind of story that would have made headlines if that really happened. You would expect that someone else other than Matthew would report that story. It would make it into Mark. It would make it into Luke. It would make it into John. It would make it into Josephus. It would make it into Tacitus or Philo or the Talmud or somewhere. No one else on the planet knows that these people came out of their graves and walked around and appeared to many people. So I would personally question whether that story actually took place. You have in chapter 2 of Matthew, not a miracle story, but a story that Matthew reports that Herod killed every 2-year-old boy, baby boy, under the age of 2 in Bethlehem and all the surrounding cities. Well, that also would have been a pretty big news story. And if it really happened as reported by Matthew, you would expect someone else would tell the story or know about it. And yet it's not really recapitulated anywhere else. So I think those are the two approaches I would take when analyzing any of these miracle stories. Number one, did it happen? Do I have any reason to believe the story as told uncritically? And number two, even if it did happen, what is its significance? What would it prove? But thank you for your question, and we'll have to wait until we get to Mark, because I unfortunately do not know the New Testament by heart. So I don't remember what Mark actually says.
Hey, thank you so much, Alon.
Thank you, Rob.
Good question. We'll talk to you soon. Thanks. Bye.
Yes.
Hey, Rabbi, back on track.
So I think that the hand washing story, I think, is where maybe we'll stop here, because the answer Jesus gives is interesting. They tell us, they joke and they say that a Jew always answers a question with a question. And so when Jesus is posed this question by the Pharisees, he doesn't really give them a straight answer. He responds by asking a question which is a little bit hard to understand, and it's going to take us a little bit of time. So rather than rush through it now, I think we'll hold off until next week when we can start chapter 15 properly.
You know what? That sounds like a good plan.
Okay. So we did chapter 14 and a little tiny peek into the beginning of chapter 15.
Or you could say leak, like I...
Okay. The boat is leaking into chapter 15.
I have no idea why I used that word leak. It was just, I don't know. It was flowing, Anyway, good enough. Rabbi, it's been a really neat week. It's been a good episode this week. There's a lot of shared information. There's still a lot of questions, a lot of uncertainties. Just seeing the more we read through this together, and all of us who are watching, seeing all of these inconsistencies, if you will, that really begs to have us to really research this more and not take everything at face value so easily.
If I can really get a good sense as to pinpoint more accurately when this law requiring all people wash their hands, when that was enacted, I'll try to report back next week about that.
That'd be good to know. Very good, Rabbi. Thank you so much for everything. It's been a great week. Good episode. And until next week, same time, same place.
And I wish everyone a Chodesh Tov, a good new moon.
A good new moon coming up.
New moon of Tammuz. It was today and tomorrow.
Very good. Very good. Thank you, Rabbi. Love you. And we will talk to you guys next week. Shalom, shalom. Until then, Laila Tov, or Boker Tov, depending on where you live.
אני אתה אתם תמיד כולם ביחד, חשוב מכל חשוב והכרחי להיות ביחד. איפוק זו העוצמה, ויתור זו הגדולה, השאיפה והכמיהה.